So this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weighed 13 ounces. End of the first week, tortoise number 2 weighed 15 ounces. End of second week, tortoise number 3 weighed 17 ounces. End of third week, tortoise number 4 weighed 19 ounces. End of fourth week, tortoise number 5 weighed 21 ounces. End of fifth week, tortoise number 6 weighed 23 ounces. End of sixth week, tortoise number 7 weighed 25 ounces. End of seventh week, tortoise number 8 weighed 27 ounces. Alpha's was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think?" "I can't see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy had answered casually. But now, perhaps, is time to call a halt, and that evening Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out, suggest Mrs. Silver that she ought to weigh Alfie, when a startled cry from the balcony below brought him outside fast. "Look!" Mrs. Silver was shouting. "Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously." "Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him quick." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in half a minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before. Oh, you darling!" she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great big wonderful boy! Just look what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Mrs. Silver cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed downstairs, and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together they went out onto the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's a big good-sized tortoise now," said Mr. Hoppy. "And you did it!" Mrs. Silver cried. "You are a miracle man, you are indeed." "But what I am going to do about his house," Mrs. Silver said. "He must have a house to go into at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise, who was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silver said. "Don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. "You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs just a tiny bit smaller and he could get in easily." "How can he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver asked. "That's simple," Mr. Hoppy said. "Change the magic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get smaller and smaller. But in tortoise language, of course. Will that work?" "Of course it'll work. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy." Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, "Esio Trot, Esio Tot, Tegatube Relums, a Tib Relums." "That'll do it, Mrs. Silver," he said, handing her the paper. "I don't mind trying it," Mrs. Silver said, "but look here, I wouldn't want him to get Titchy small all over again." "Mr. Hoppy, he won't, my dear lady, he won't," Mr. Hoppy said. "Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky. If it works," Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, "then you are the cleverest man alive."